The morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Westbridge Academy, casting long gold stripes across the polished cafeteria floor where Ms. Clark, a soft-spoken white teacher with a quiet sense of justice, noticed once again the subtle habits of separation that everyone else pretended not to see. She watched students gather at the glossy center tables, where laughter rose freely and privilege sat proudly, while at the dim back rose a cluster of children of color, including Maya Hayes. Ate with the practiced stillness of those who did not want attention drawn to them. Maya was a bright 12-year-old who loved science. But recently, she had grown quieter, almost translucent in her attempts to remain unnoticed. And Ms. Clark felt a familiar twist in her chest whenever she saw the girl lower her head to avoid another whispered insult from the students who believed their family names granted them authority. Her instincts as a teacher told her something was wrong, yet years of working under administrators who discouraged complaints convinced her to move carefully. So she watched closely, hoping the truth would reveal itself before it swallowed the children it targeted. That same morning, miles away, Maya's father, Jonathan Hayes, buttoned his shirt with an excitement he had not felt in months, because for once he had cleared his schedule and decided to surprise his daughter at lunchtime, determined to remind her that he still saw her, still cherished her, still missed the days when they shared sandwiches and silly jokes before life's pressures grew too heavy. He stopped by a small deli they used to visit and ordered her favorite meal, hoping it might coax a smile from her after noticing a tired pause in her voice during last night's call. A hesitation he could not shake. Jonathan parked in the visitor lot and walked the familiar hallway with a warm anticipation that carried him straight to the cafeteria doors. But the moment he stepped inside, his heartbeat stalled, because instead of Maya's joy, he saw Maya's humiliation. A stern cafeteria manager stood over her, scolding her for sitting too close to the center tables, as if proximity to privilege were a violation of school law. And as Jonathan froze in disbelief, the manager pushed Maya's tray aside, forcing her backward toward the dark corner where a group of silent minority students sat like shadows of the room. Jonathan's jaw tightened as laughter erupted around her, while no teacher intervened, not even the ones standing close enough to hear every cruel word. Though Ms. Clark's stricken expression revealed she at least understood the weight of what was unfolding, Jonathan felt something inside him fracture as he watched Maya shrink smaller with every second. Her shoulders curled inward the way a child folds into herself when the world becomes too sharp to touch. Yet she said nothing. She simply obeyed, because she had learned obeying preserved survival. He stood motionless at the doorway, torn between storming forward and gathering evidence, because he sensed with chilling clarity that this was not a one-time incident, but a system carefully constructed to thrive in silence. Now his hands trembled around the small lunch bag he had brought with such joy, while the truth settled like ice in his chest. If this was what he saw in 30 seconds, what had Maya endured over months? His breath caught, his voice died in his throat, and Ms. Clark glanced toward him, recognizing the despair of a parent discovering a reality his child had hidden to protect him. And as he watched Maya step into that corner seat that was never truly hers, he whispered the beginning of a promise not yet formed, but already burning inside him, a vow that whatever this hidden structure was, it would not stand unchallenged. For the first time, Jonathan understood why Maya always said she was fine, in the same steady voice people use when telling the truth might collapse their world. And while students continued eating as if cruelty were routine, he felt both powerless and violently awakened. He remained still long enough to witness the final quiet tremor of Maya's hands as she lifted her ruined lunch. And in that moment, a wave of determination washed through him, stronger than fear, deeper than anger. He realized he could not unsee what was happening. He could not unhear the mockery. He could not unknow the quiet suffering of a daughter who deserved better than the shadow she had been pushed into. Fate had pulled back a curtain he never meant to touch, but now that he had seen the truth, Jonathan Hayes would not look away again. His whisper barely reached his own ears, yet it echoed like thunder inside him. What have they been doing to my child? Jonathan remained still for several long breaths, hidden partly behind the cafeteria doorway as he tried to understand the scene unraveling in front of him. And the longer he watched, the clearer it became that Maya's humiliation was not an accidental moment, but a polished routine crafted through daily repetition. He lifted his phone with a trembling hand and began recording, because instinct told him this truth would be denied if not documented. The cafeteria manager strutted through the aisles With the certainty of someone who believed authority meant absolute control dividing the room through her tone and posture as she directed the wealthiest students to the comfortable center tables while gesturing dismissively toward the shadowed benches where Maya and the other minority students sat like an afterthought. Jonathan recorded the exact cadence of her voice when she told a black boy to stop asking for water because scholarship students only received certain privileges at scheduled times, while moments later she cheerfully allowed a white student to refill his bottle without a single comment. His stomach tightened as he realized these rules were not rules at all, but social weapons meant to reinforce who belonged and who did not belong, and Maya had lived inside that system every school day. While telling him she was fine, never wanting to trouble him with the heavy truth, Ms. Clark lingered nearby, visibly uneasy but too afraid of the administration to intervene, though her sympathetic glances toward Maya and the other segregated students revealed a conscience struggling against fear. The camera captured everything: the forced seating, the mocking whispers, the calculated indifference of teachers who pretended not to hear, the cruelty happening directly beside them. Every detail chipped at Jonathan's heart because he understood that emotional wounds hidden from adults were often the deepest, and Maya had chosen silence to protect him from disappointment or guilt. He watched her attempt to eat lunch with small, careful motions, as if minimizing her existence reduced the chances of being targeted again, and his guilt pressed down on him with unbearable force when the cafeteria manager lectured the room about tradition donors and premium seating. Jonathan realized the ideology behind the hierarchy was not subtle, it was proudly spoken, disguised as policy, and accepted because families with influence preferred it that way. Then Jonathan saw the moment that broke him completely. Maya stood up slowly to dispose of her ruined lunch, but before she could cross the center tables, the manager blocked her path and pointed her toward the farthest trash bin near the loading doors, as if proximity to the main area was contamination. Jonathan recorded her expression, the flicker of shame, the resigned obedience, the quiet acceptance that she did not deserve the same path as everyone else. This was systematic, not incidental. Ms. Clark glanced nervously between Jonathan and the staff, sensing a storm forming, though she did not yet know its scale. Jonathan's breath grew shallow, filled with grief, anger, and a new clarity that frightened even him, because he knew he could no longer remain a quiet parent trusting the system to protect his child. The system was the danger itself. He stepped forward just enough to see Maya's slumped shoulders, and that single sight pushed him past hesitation. His hand tightened around the lunch bag he had brought with such tenderness earlier, and the contrast between the love in that gesture and the cruelty he was witnessing ignited something fierce inside him. A father's vow formed silently but powerfully that he would confront this injustice and dismantle whatever structure had convinced children they were lesser. He walked toward Maya, though every student watching seemed startled by his sudden movement. Ms. Clark noticed him first, and her relief mixed with worry, as though she understood he was about to cross a line that could not be uncrossed. When he reached Maya's table, he placed the lunch bag gently before her and rested a steady hand on her shoulder, startling her from her attempt to hide her tears. Her eyes widened not with comfort, but with fear, because she knew the school punished any disruption, and she believed his simple arrival would make her situation worse. Jonathan felt that sting sharply, but he forced a calm tone into his voice, reassuring her softly, though every inch of him was burning. Then the cafeteria manager stormed over, ready to assert her dominance again, and demanded to know who he was, assessing him in a single glance and dismissing him instantly. Jonathan held his composure even as she belittled him, mocked his appearance, and implied he could not possibly afford to send Maya here, but her assumptions were nothing compared to the deeper crime unfolding. She insisted Maya belonged in the corner because students like her needed structure and reminders of hierarchy, while Jonathan clenched his jaw to keep anger from erupting too soon. A teacher approached the commotion, and instead of listening to Jonathan, she immediately summoned the principal, who arrived with an air of bored superiority. He barely glanced at Jonathan before siding with his staff, calling Jonathan's concern a disturbance, insisting Maya was not mistreated, and threatening disciplinary review if Jonathan continued to challenge the school's authority. Jonathan tried to explain calmly, but the principal ordered security guards to remove him, labeling him aggressive. Despite his steady demeanor, Maya sobbed, begging him to leave because she feared expulsion more than daily cruelty, and that broke him more deeply than the guards' hands on his arms as they escorted him toward the exit. Jonathan realized in that instant that his daughter had learned to accept injustice to survive it, and that knowledge hardened his resolve as the cafeteria doors closed behind him and the laughter of privileged students echoed faintly. He whispered a vow he would come back not as the parent they dismissed, but as the force they never expected. Jonathan stood in the parking lot with the cafeteria doors still echoing in his memory, the humiliation of being forced out the same way his daughter had been forced into the corner for months. And the more he replayed the scene, the sharper his purpose became, until the trembling in his hands steadied into something cold, focused, and immovable. He sat inside his car, exhaled slowly, and looked down at the glowing screen, where 27 minutes of footage waited like undeniable truth every second day. Piece of evidence no administrator could twist into a misunderstanding. His pulse slowed as clarity replaced shock, and he realized he could not simply storm back inside the school in outrage, because outrage was exactly what they expected from a father they believed held no real leverage. Instead, he unlocked the version of himself Maya rarely saw, the version that moved through national meetings, negotiated education policies, and understood the legal weight behind every decision affecting American schools. Jonathan dialed the first number with steady fingers, and when the federal civil rights officer answered, he identified himself calmly, issued his credentials, and reported an active violation at a federally supported institution, requesting immediate response under emergency protocol. The agent on the other end shifted tone instantly and confirmed a team would mobilize before asking for supporting evidence, which Jonathan already had prepared in the form of video, audio, and a detailed verbal statement. He made a second call to the Department of Education, where he served as a senior policy advisor, and informed his deputy of the situation, framing it not as a complaint, but as a breach of federal compliance that endangered minors and misused public funds. His third call went to legal counsel, who advised him on documentation, chain of custody, and steps necessary to ensure every piece of evidence remained admissible. Jonathan completed each call with the same quiet composure, building a chain of authority that would soon be felt across every hallway of the school. Meanwhile, inside the cafeteria, staff members congratulated themselves for removing what they viewed as a disruptive parent, unaware that the man they dismissed as powerless held influence over the very funding they relied upon. Students whispered and laughed, replaying the scene on their phones, while Maya sat trembling, fearing the consequences that would fall on her more than anyone else. Ms. Clark walked past her, unable to shake the dread that something monumental had just shifted, though she did not know what would follow. Outside, the dull roar of distant engines grew louder as unmarked federal vehicles crossed the school lot, followed by local police support, and soon the quiet grounds of Westbridge Academy filled with the coordinated arrival of teams trained to investigate institutional misconduct. Administrators peered through office windows in confusion as agents stepped out, wearing jackets marked with bold insignias that carried authority. Impossible to ignore. The principal was intercepted near the main corridor, escorted politely yet firmly to his office, where he found Jonathan already seated in the chair he claimed earlier, as though reclaiming the dignity stripped away minutes before. The principal sputtered with indignation, demanding to know why Jonathan had returned and why federal agents were in his building, but the answer became clear the moment Jonathan placed his phone on the desk, connected it to the office display, and let the footage play. The cafeteria manager arrived moments later, her voice drying in her throat as her own words filled the room, amplified by speakers revealing every insult, laugh, dismissal, and discriminatory command she had delivered with pride, not knowing she was documenting her own downfall. The air thickened as agents took notes, cataloged timestamps, and explained calmly which actions constituted civil rights violations, misuse of authority, and potential criminal conduct. The principal attempted to interrupt, blaming misunderstandings, miscommunications, and Jonathan's alleged hostility, but the agents were unmoved. They had seen enough schools like this to understand the pattern. When the video ended, Jonathan spoke not in anger, but in measured, controlled certainty, explaining that the school's federal funding was now suspended pending investigation, and that both the principal and cafeteria manager were to be questioned under federal protocol. The manager's face drained of color as agents stepped forward, instructing her to stand and turning her around for handcuffs, while students outside the office began to gather. Drawn by the commotion, the principal attempted to resist, insisting on protocol and privacy, But he too was restrained when agents informed him he was under detainment. For potential interference with federal investigation, students pressed their faces against the hallway windows, phones recording every moment, capturing the reversal of power unfolding before them. The agents exited the office, flanking the two administrators as they walked down the main corridor, stunned staff members stepping aside and children gasping at the sight of the once untouchable authority figures being led away. Jonathan followed at a calm, measured pace, each step carrying the weight of a father reclaiming his daughter's dignity. At the entrance, he paused long enough to watch the administrators placed into waiting vehicles, then turned back toward the school, knowing his work was only beginning because what he had witnessed inside the cafeteria was not just an isolated cruelty, but a system allowed to thrive in silence. And that silence was about to be shattered completely. He instructed agents to gather every student and staff member in the gymnasium for a formal address, one that would expose the truth to all who had lived under its shadow. And as he walked toward that destined moment, he whispered a final vow under his breath. This ends today. The gymnasium filled with a trembling hush as students and teachers were ushered to the bleachers under the watchful presence of federal agents whose silent authority sent ripples of unease through every corner of the vast hall. While whispers rose and fell like nervous waves, students clutched their phones, uncertain whether they should film or hide them, and teachers stood rigid along the walls, trying to avoid meeting anyone's eyes, especially the students they had silently watched suffer for months. Ms. Clark sat near the front, her heart hammering, because although she had always suspected something was wrong, she had never imagined that federal agents would descend upon the school, or that one quiet father could ignite such a sweeping dismantling of everything the administration had insisted was normal. When Jonathan entered the gym, he did not carry the anger of a man seeking revenge, but the heavy resolve of a father determined to expose the truth, even if it scorched the institution from the inside out. His presence silenced every whisper as he walked to center court, accompanied by agents who stood behind him like pillars, reinforcing the gravity of the moment. He introduced himself, without flourish, stating calmly that he was Maya Hayes' father and a federal education official, and the gym responded with a collective gasp as the pieces of the unfolding drama snapped together in the minds of students and staff. Jonathan held up his phone, connected it to the projection system, and allowed the footage to fill the giant screen, commanding attention. With the raw, unfiltered cruelty it displayed, the cafeteria manager's voice echoed the same superiority that had once cowed students, now exposed before hundreds, as her insults reverberated across the bleachers, while the principal appeared repeatedly in the background, ignoring the actions unfolding under his watch. Students who once laughed at Maya's humiliation now watched with wide, horrified eyes as they saw themselves in the margins of the video, complicit through silence or amused disbelief, and regret washed over many who had never fully understood the impact of what they considered ordinary lunchtime drama. The minority students who had lived that quiet torment every day lowered their heads in painful recognition, while others wiped tears from their eyes. Jonathan paused the video at the moment where Maya flinched from a shove, and the gym seemed to hold its breath as he explained that this was not only a moral failure, but a legal one that violated federal civil rights protections. Jonathan then called Maya and the other marginalized students to step into the court, and as they walked hesitantly through the aisle, dozens of students whispered apologies under their breath, too late to erase the harm, but sincere in their guilt. Maya stood beside her father, trembling, but no longer alone, and Jonathan knelt to meet her eyes, offering an apology not for what he did, but for what he had failed to see. For the 7 months she endured cruelty in silence, he promised her in front of the entire school that she would never again face pain unseen or unprotected, and the vulnerability in that brief exchange silenced even the hardest hearts among the audience. When Jonathan rose, he delivered a sweeping directive explaining that federal monitors would take over operations immediately, that discriminatory seating policies were abolished, and that any staff member who had witnessed or enabled bias would undergo formal review. He clarified that students who participated in harassment would enter restorative programs. Mandatory counseling and reflection processes meant not to punish, but to reshape their understanding of empathy and responsibility. Staff paled at the mention of disciplinary review, realizing their complacency was no longer shielded by titles or tenure. The gym shook with emotion as Jonathan announced that Every student previously relegated to the cafeteria corner would receive academic and emotional support financed by redirected school funds, and the news sent a visible wave of relief through the group of students who had long suffered invisibility. Their peers looked at them differently, now not as outsiders, but as survivors of a system that none of them had questioned until confronted with its ugliness. Jonathan then spoke to the entire student body, delivering a lesson that few would forget: that silence in the face of injustice was a choice, and that every person in that gym bore some responsibility for what had happened, even if their role had been unintentional or passive. His words struck the teachers hardest, many of whom dissolved into tears as they realized how deeply they had betrayed the children entrusted to their care. When he finished speaking, the gym stood in a silence heavier than any reprimand, because the weight of truth had settled on every soul present. Jonathan walked Maya toward the exit while students watched in reverence, understanding that a revolution had occurred not through anger, but through truth spoken aloud and justice enforced with compassion. As the federal oversight team took control of the school, Jonathan whispered to Maya that this day would not break her, but rebuild her, and that the darkness she endured would serve as proof that light grew strongest where injustice once thrived. In the days following the federal takeover, Westbridge Academy transformed from a sanctuary of unchecked privilege into the epicenter of a civil rights investigation that stretched far beyond anything the staff had anticipated, and as agents conducted interviews, the hidden layers of discrimination surfaced faster than anyone could contain them. Students who had long remained silent found the courage to speak, describing lunchroom incidents, hallway harassment, classroom bias, and subtle rules designed to keep children of color in perpetual disadvantage, while teachers admitted under trembling voices that they had been discouraged from challenging these practices for fear of losing their jobs or upsetting influential families. What began as one recorded lunchtime humiliation unfolded into a pattern stretching years back, revealing that Maya's suffering was not an anomaly, but the continuation of a system carefully protected by tradition, reputation, and financial influence. Federal investigators uncovered emails where administrators boasted about maintaining order through selective discipline and allocating premium resources only to donor children, while diverting funds intended for equity programs into private initiatives that benefited a narrow circle of families. The cafeteria manager's disciplinary log revealed language so openly biased that seasoned investigators paused in disbelief, realizing the case was no longer about misconduct, but about intentional violation of federal civil rights protections. When former students were contacted, many came forward with stories that mirrored Maya's humiliation: stories of being told to sit in corners, use separate trash bins, refrain from speaking to donor families, and accept that they were lucky to be there even if the environment shattered their confidence. These testimonies built a mountain of evidence, leading to public charges that sent shockwaves through the community and thrust the school into national headlines. Local parents who once supported strict traditions now backed away, claiming ignorance, while others demanded accountability for the harm inflicted on children entrusted to the institution. Meanwhile, Jonathan worked closely with federal officials to ensure that the case was not framed as an isolated scandal, but as an example of what unchecked authority could become when hidden behind polished brochures and celebrated academic rankings. The trial that followed months later drew massive attention, filling the courtroom with reporters, families, and advocates. As the cafeteria manager, principal, and several administrators faced charges ranging from civil rights violations to misuse of federal funding and negligent supervision. Maya was called to testify, and though her voice trembled at first, she spoke with remarkable clarity, describing the fear of returning to school every day, the dread of lunch period, the pain of being pushed to the edge of the cafeteria, and the shame of believing she had to endure it in silence because complaining would make things worse. The court listened with heavy hearts as she explained that she had pretended to be fine to avoid adding stress to her father's already demanding life, and that she carried the belief that maybe she had failed somehow, maybe she had not fit the image the school expected. As each student testified, the narrative became impossible to dismiss, and the defense attorneys quickly realized there was no argument strong enough to counter the lived experiences of dozens of children who described parallel versions of the same oppression. The verdicts came swiftly, finding the cafeteria manager and principal guilty on multiple counts, while additional administrators were barred from educational work indefinitely. in order to participate in reparation and training, the community reacted with a blend of outrage, grief, and astonishment as news outlets broadcast the story across the nation, highlighting the case as a turning point in the fight for equity within private and publicly supported institutions across the country. Schools scrambled to review their own practices, aware that federal monitors were now empowered to investigate any complaint that echoed the Westbridge case. Jonathan used the momentum to collaborate with lawmakers and civil rights advocates, crafting a policy framework that would later be known as the Foundation Equity Act, a bill requiring schools receiving any public support to document seating assignments, discipline patterns, resource distribution, and access to extracurricular opportunities. Ensuring transparency to prevent hidden hierarchies, Maya's testimony became a catalyst for youth advocacy groups, inspiring students nationwide to report biases they had previously endured quietly and prompting educators to rethink how their assumptions shaped school culture. The slow, grinding machinery of justice had begun to turn, and while it could not erase the harm done to Maya and her peers, its movement signaled the beginning of structural change that would protect future students. By the time the trial concluded, Westbridge Academy had become a symbol of both deep failure and unprecedented transformation as new leadership prepared to rebuild the school through honesty, equality, and compassion, while Jonathan and Maya prepared for the next chapter, knowing that true justice demanded continuation, not closure. Yet even in the midst of ongoing reforms, Maya felt the faint but undeniable stir of hope rising from the ruins of the institution that had once broken her 3 years after the investigation. Westbridge Academy looked unrecognizable, transformed from a rigid hierarchy into a vibrant community defined by inclusion, empathy, and transparency. And as students gathered for graduation, the gym, once filled with trembling silence, now echoed with hopeful anticipation. Maya Hayes stood backstage, smoothing her gown with steady hands, amazed at how far she had traveled from the frightened girl who once ate lunch in the shadows to the confident young woman chosen as valedictorian for her unwavering excellence and resilient spirit. Ms. Clark, now a respected leader in the reformed faculty, approached her with a gentle smile, expressing pride not only in Maya's academic achievements, but in the courage she displayed when she chose to speak truth in a place that had tried to silence her. The cafeteria that once symbolized exclusion had been torn down, rebuilt as a communal hall named the Maya Hayes Unity Center, a reminder carved in stone of the moment a system of cruelty collapsed under the weight of accountability and the power of a single child's quiet suffering brought to light. When Maya stepped onto the stage, the audience fell silent, struck by the maturity in her eyes and the gravity of the moment. As she began her speech, recounting how she once believed that shrinking herself would keep her safe, how she thought invisibility was easier than confrontation, and how she carried guilt for conditions she did not create, her voice grew stronger as she described the day her father walked into her nightmare, unknowingly carrying the spark that would ignite national reforms. And she spoke of the thousands of students across the country who reached out to her after the documentary aired, telling her that her story gave them the courage to report injustices in their own schools. Maya reminded the audience that justice did not arrive instantly, nor did healing come without uncertainty, but transformation began the moment truth was spoken aloud, even if spoken through trembling breath. She urged her classmates to recognize their influence even when they felt powerless, because silence sustains harm while compassion dismantles it. Jonathan watched from the front row, overwhelmed with pride and humbled by the realization that his determination had reshaped not only his daughter's life, but the landscape of education for countless children. When he took the stage after Maya, he addressed the parents with a steady voice, reminding them that institutions are not inherently safe simply because they promise excellence, and that vigilance begins with asking difficult questions, witnessing their children's daily realities, and valuing emotional well-being as much as academic success. He held up the same phone that once recorded Maya's suffering, explaining that the device became the tool that protected her, and he urged families to use their own voices and presence to safeguard children who may be enduring unspoken pain. The applause that followed thundered through the auditorium, not as celebration of punishment, but as recognition of renewal, accountability, and hope. After the ceremony, Jonathan and Maya walked across the campus, pausing near the spot where she had once been forced to sit, and Maya touched the renovated benches with a thoughtful smile, acknowledging that her past no longer held the power to define her future. They spoke quietly about what came next, Maya preparing for early admission to a prestigious university with a full scholarship, and Jonathan continuing his nationwide work to strengthen equity policies, inspired by the courage his daughter showed when she testified against those who wronged her. As they reached the gate, Maya asked whether they had truly changed anything or if the world would simply find new ways to hide injustice, and Jonathan responded that change was never complete, but every tear she shed, every truth she told, and every reform sparked by her story ensured that countless children would experience safer kinder schools. Because she refused to stay invisible, Maya nodded, understanding that her strength had become a beacon for others, and together they stepped forward into the sunlight, leaving behind the place where her pain began, but carrying with them the knowledge that courage does not erase suffering, it transforms it into power. They walked toward the car, surrounded by cheers, conversation, and hope, knowing that their journey had reshaped lives far beyond the walls of Westbridge Academy. And as they drove away, Maya gazed out the window, reflecting on the long road from silence to empowerment, whispering a vow to continue speaking truth wherever injustice tried to hide.